Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our Right Night tonight. I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nathan Smolin. He got a PhD in classics a bit ago and is now teaching Latin in native Alabama and is here to tell us about practical lessons from the monastic tradition. So everyone, please welcome Nathan Smolin.
All right, so the talk is titled Practical Lessons from the Monastic Tradition. So the first question is, why would I want to talk about that? And I came up with this very, very quickly. Actually, I was like, what would I like to talk about to a bunch of random young adult Catholics? And I was like, I want to talk about monasticism. And the reason for that is mostly personal. So I'm a convert to Catholicism. I converted to Catholicism when I was 17. Been a while now. And I was really drawn into Catholicism. I grew up, I guess, in the Presbyterian church. I grew up with Calvinism. So a very intellectual faith, basically, a tradition that has a lot of strengths, but it's very, very intellectual. When I encountered sort of Catholic tradition, I was really blown away by kind of the richness of it, that it wasn't just an intellectual system, that it had this whole element of kind of, it could be lived out, right? It dealt with every aspect of the person. It wasn't just the head, it was the heart, it was sort of everything. And the idea that you can live a certain way and it can actually change you over time was enormously powerful to me. A lot of the stuff I read during that time period was stuff from monks and nuns and stuff I continued to read. And all on that sort of question of, this sort of, how do you kind of become better? How do you become a better person in this very practical way that's very clearly lived out? So that's why I wanted to talk about, the main reason I wanted to talk about monastic life. Mostly a side note, but I think, I guess, I feel like I often have, as a convert, I have friends who are cradle Catholics, and I often hear from them the complaint that they didn't sort of get the same richness that I got out of the Catholic tradition growing up. That they would, like to hear more about what's actually out there in terms of Catholicism. And I think, I can't really speak to that, but I do think in reading about American Catholic history and in being in the American Catholic Church, I think I really decided, which is not an original opinion, that one of the things that sets apart American Catholicism is that we actually have much less of a presence of monastic life or contemplative life than other Catholic societies. This is something that has been commented on a lot. And if you go back to the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII, he wrote a whole thing condemning the heresy of Americanism, which is funny. But what he meant by Americanism is this particular set of ideas and cultural preferences that meant that the contemplative life has no value or no meaning. It's that the sort of activism. And I think this is a deeply embedded idea in American culture, that what we think is good and important, even religious people, especially religious people, if you're a good person, a very religious person, you believe the truth and you do things. You do really public things. You do really outward things. You talk to people. You tell people about the truth. You help other people. Everything you do is very, very active and very, very outward. And there's this idea because of that, what could be worse than to have monks, basically. It's not the idea that it's not just stupid, but it's actually harmful to society, because you're taking all these young people, these young men, these young women who could be, raising families to support the nation. They could be working, they could be plowing, they could be in factories, they could be doing all kinds of things. They could be learning, and instead you're forcing them to commit all of their energies to this kind of activity that apparently has no value, right? That does not benefit anyone, supposedly, right? And I think American Catholics like to kind of do apologetics where we're like, well, actually, monks help people in various ways, or monks do this, or monks do that, but that doesn't really answer the accusation exactly. Because, well, if monks are good because monks, develop science or technology, then that doesn't get to the basic question, which is a contemplative life valuable, right? Or is the only valuable life the active life? And again, Leo XIII was trying to affirm what is the stated teaching of the Catholic Church, that the contemplative life is not only good, but it's actually better than the active life, which maybe is not what we want to hear as people who are living the active life. But that contemplation is superior to action, the contemplative life is better than the active life. But I think it's actually helpful as a layperson to know that, because I can still learn from the monks. You can still learn from it. And the whole point of saying that it's a higher thing is that we can all look to it and we all kind of aspire to it in some way or other. So yeah, that's basically a kind of a long proem, the main part of what I'm actually going to say, but hopefully that makes sense. That's my pitch for why I wanted to talk about the monastic life. But again, I did want to approach it in a way that was more practical and more personal. I'm not going to give a talk on like the history of monastic life. I'm not going to talk about different religious orders or any of those sorts of things, which you can learn about if you want to. But what I want to talk about is after reading, spending many years reading all these monastic authors, the things that I found most personally helpful, the ideas I wasn't aware of before, or that helped me in living my life and I think becoming a better Catholic. So I initially just wrote down a bunch of different bullet points and I managed to eliminate half of them in the interest of time. So I got it down. I think I started with like 7 or 8. I got it down to 4, which I was very proud of. Just 4 bullet points. And the 4 bullet points are patience, number 1, number 2, obedience, number 3, community, and number 4, contemplation. So patience, obedience, community, and contemplation. And I like that the latter 2 are alliterative. I really am a fan of alliteration. Patience, obedience, community, and contemplation. What I'm going to do is just talk about those one by one, and hopefully it won't be too super long, because I could talk about this probably forever, but I'm not going to, Mara, I promise. All right. So number 1 is patience. And I want to talk about this because, again, I debated actually what to call this point. Patience is a little bit misleading. I thought about calling it paciencia or patientia, which is a Latin word, but I thought it was a little pretentious. And then I was like, maybe I should call it tolerance, because that's maybe a little misleading. But so we'll start with patience, and I'll explain what I mean by it, if that's helpful. So, because I think in monastic literature, especially medieval monastic literature, they mean something very specific by patience or paciencia, something that I feel like isn't talked about as much in modern Catholic circles. And what they mean by it is basically, again, in some ways closer to the modern idea of tolerance, though I think it's much better in a lot of ways than the modern idea of tolerance as it's commonly expressed. But it's basically patience or paciencia means especially, it's a habitual virtue by which you put up with other people's sins and also your own sins in a secondary level. That's what it means. Again, when we talk about patience today, we don't mostly think about waiting for things, right? Or we think about maybe suffering horrible things, but specifically it's other people are doing bad things, you're doing bad things, you know that it's bad, you know that it's evil, you know that it's wrong, but you are able to put up with it and suffer it in a way that is helpful. And that might seem kind of paradoxical. Why would we want to put up with bad things? Why would we want to put up with sins in ourselves or in other people? But again, the monastic authors talk about it a lot, and they make it one of the most important authors. So I wrote down a quote from Peter Damian, who's writing a letter to a monk who had left his monastery. And he says, "Of all the things that are commended to us by God's law, there is nothing for which a monk should strive more earnestly than that in all circumstances he have patience, by which he might calmly bear the offense given by another's wickedness." He goes on to say that this virtue brings a monk to the heights of perfection, and it provides victory over all vices. So in this letter, he basically argues patience or paciencia is the virtue that brings together the whole monastic life. It's the most important virtue for a monk to have. It kind of puts it all together. So why would this be the case? Why would it be so important to be able to put up other people's horrible things? I think the first answer is just very practical, which is if you're trying to run a monastic community with say 30 young men or women, they're going to get up and they're living together 24/7 and praying together. They're going to really get on each other's nerves all the time. So it's a very practical problem, which is also clear to me from teaching middle schoolers. The most annoying thing about teaching middle schoolers is it's not them doing bad things. It's them tallying on each other. It's so annoying. It's like, hey, it's like you just did the same thing 2 minutes ago. Like, stop telling me that I don't want to hear from you. Like, stop, please. It's so awful. So that's one idea. It's just practical. If you're going to live in community, you have to be able to put up with other people's problems, other people's sins to some degree. It's just a practical necessity, which I think is actually, in some ways, a very important point that we don't think about enough, which is what is necessary for community. Part of it is every time you see a bad thing happening, you can't just rush at their throats and stab them in the monastery courtyard. And I think it's also, you could say similar things about it being important. for yourself too, that if you want to overcome your own sins, again, this is a very important idea in monastic life, you overcome sins over time. You live in community, you live as a monk, you practice, basically, and you get better over time. But if you're an impatient monk with yourself, if you come to the monastery and you don't enjoy it, and you have all these habitual sins, and they keep happening, then you give up and you leave, right? That's a common idea in monastic literature too. That you give up and you leave, and it's no good, basically. So again, you have to have patience with yourself, you have to have patience with others, or else community life can't work at all. And again, on a more highfalutin level, again, the ultimate argument that these authors make is that for love, in this world, love requires patience. It requires a willingness, a habitual ability to deal with other people's shortcomings and sins, basically. That's absolutely important. And this is how God loves us too, right? Christ doesn't just kill us all, he doesn't just transform us in an instant, but he suffers and puts up with our sins to a very extreme degree, over and over and over and over and over again. And that the monk who is supposed to imitate Christ is called to the same degree and the same level of patience. Yes, like with that bug. Yes, we should all have patience with that bug, despite his many sins.
The providential bug.
Yeah, look at him. He's terrible. He's just sitting right there, right in front of us.
He's probably in a panic. What is this surface that I've never encountered before?
But I do think that this is a very, for me, it's been very practically important, because living in modern life, living in modern America, living in the modern church, you can't live as a Catholic without coming up against people who are doing bad things, or God, you can't live as a Catholic without, recognizing yourself doing bad things. Because if you can't recognize that and put up with it to some degree, you either lie to yourself, right, or you just give up. And those are, I think, in being Catholic, I think that's a common thing I've seen with people who are trying to practice Catholicism for the first time. Just like people becoming monks in their ages. They either lie about their sins and everything's getting better, or they just give up and stop trying, basically. But having this real deep patience with yourself and others is the only way I think we're gonna, is what the church is called to, I think, especially in the modern America. That's point number one. Point number two is obedience, which is, I think, very tied to that. So when you're living in a monastery, other people are doing bad things, or you're in a classroom with a bunch of 12-year-olds, the teacher is supposed to deal with certain things, right? The teacher is supposed to tell people what to do. You're not supposed to punish each other. There's a structure of authority and obedience. And this is obviously talked about enormously amount in monastic literature, and I think it's something that we find the hardest to make sense of, why there's so much emphasis on obedience. It's a constant refrain in all monastic literature. Obedience is so important. The virtue of obedience, practice obedience, do obedience, 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 obedience. It can sound very weird and also disturbing to us, especially in America. Just to take one quote out of, St. Faustina Kowalska, right, the Apostle of Divine Mercy, says that our efforts, no matter how great, are not pleasing to God unless they bear the seal of obedience. So she says, you can't please God without obedience. That's just like the absolute bare minimum. And again, we ask why. Why would we want to have a system like a monastic system where everyone has a superior all the time? You always have a superior who you obey. That's a very important principle of monastic life. No one is another superior. And again, one answer might be a relatively practical one, which is that, okay, the Catholic Church teaches that the greatest sin is pride, so maybe obedience is primarily just to help us get over our pride, right? And I think that's a simple answer, but it's a very important one, which is, yeah, if you have a problem with pride, you find it really obnoxious to have to obey other people. Almost certainly, yes. You want to do your own will, you don't want to do other people's will. And breaking yourself of that really requires, the easiest way to break someone of that is to put them in a system like a monastic system where they're constantly forced to obey someone else. And again, this is, St. Faustina says that Satan can pretend to be humble, but he can't pretend to practice obedience. She says is the way you detect the devil is you try to get him, you test him with obedience, because this is the one thing the devil can't do, or can't pretend to do. Gregory the Great, who I love, talks a lot about the problem of proudful Catholics who are, he says that proudful Catholics who are not heretics hurt the church almost as much as heretics do. He has a long, beautiful passage about where he talks about the problem of prideful Catholics who will not obey, won't listen to others, think they know everything. He goes on and on and on about it. And he's also a monk as well as a pope. And again, this is a common refrain in monastic authors, is the danger of being an authority. Peter Damian rants about people want to be abbots. Bernard of Clairvaux also talks a lot about how you should not want to be a priest. He's really angry at people who want to be priests. He says it's just like people should not want to be priests because being a priest is very dangerous. Having religious authority is dangerous. In fact, it's safer to be one of the people who are obeying. It's enormously safer. Be a monk, an ordinary monk, and you're safe. Try to be a religious authority, and you're in potential danger for your soul. And they talk a lot about how dangerous this is. So again, on the one side, that makes perfect sense. If pride is our biggest problem, then obedience is an answer. And we shouldn't all want to be leaders. We shouldn't all want to be in positions of power, but we should want to be in the safer position, which is practicing obedience habitually. I think there's also maybe a more positive reason why they talk about obedience, which is maybe a little more complicated, but I think it means expressed very simply. And to do that, I have to talk about an author who's not technically a monastic author, because he's a member of a mendicant order, which is Francis of Assisi, who is not a monk, he's a friar, if that makes any sense to you. But Francis of Assisi, his idea of the Franciscan order really emphasized the idea of obedience, like the Jesuits would do later on. And Francis found this enormously important, this idea of it's better to do someone else's will rather than your own. That this is a habit. You form a habit of preferring another's will to your own is an enormously important thing for a Christian to be able to do. And he thought it was so important that he famously, after he stepped down from being head of the Franciscan order, he was very upset about the fact that everyone revered him as a living saint. So he was like, he told the head of the Franciscan order to appoint a young friar to be his personal superior and tell him what to do, basically. Humiliate me, tell me to do all kinds of humiliating, horrible things, I'll do them. And then, of course, it's a lot of comical stories where the poor young friar is like, please don't make me make you do this. And he's like, no, make me do it. Yeah. It's very comical, but it attests to how seriously Francis took this idea of he didn't want to do his own will. He wanted to be doing someone else's will, even if it was only the random will of another young friar, because he thought this was enormously spiritually important. And again, I think one idea for why this is important is, which I think we'll get into when we talk about contemplation, but if the goal of the religious life is unity with God, unity with someone involves some kind of unity in will. That we want to do the will of God. And doing the will of God is doing someone else's will. And it's a will that's very foreign to us. It's beyond our comprehension. It's very strange. It transcends everything we know about the world. And so in order to actually be able to do God's will, we have to practice doing other people's will, if that makes sense. So the goal is to be one with God, and the means are practicing obedience. So it's not just negative, but you want to do this because you want to be one with God, because you want to love God, and you want to be one with Him in will. So you practice obeying. Make sense? That's point number 2. Point number 3 is community. Community, which is, we've already talked about a lot, Snickle events, but so the word monk is from the Greek word monakos, which means solitary person. But obviously monks live in community, which is very, very important. And a lot of early monastic authors really dislike the idea of anyone wanting to be a hermit by themselves. It's a Saint Benedict rails against self-proclaimed hermits. You have to live in community. It's enormously important. And in Egyptian monasticism, the system, I believe, still is that if you want to be a hermit, you have to first live in community for a long time, and then the whole monastery votes that you're now ready to be a hermit, basically. So there's this idea of monastic life that community life is the main way in which people are supposed to live and the main way in which they're supposed to grow in holiness. And the answer to the question is why? One answer is just because you have to practice a lot of patience and obedience, right? As we talked about, people get on your nerves constantly. That's salvific. But again, a more positive answer would be, again, this very important idea, which both Gregory the Great and Augustine talk about, which is sort of what is the nature of God? We think about the idea of God being love. The idea becomes that God is a good that you can kind of only possess in common with other people. He is a communal good. Gregory the Great talks about how you should, if you want to be free from envy, you should set your desire on that inheritance, which no number of fellow sharers serves to decrease or diminish, which is both one for all and whole to each. So no matter how many people share in God, God isn't diminished. Everyone has the whole of God, right? And Augustine even says that unless you're willing to share God with other people, you can't possess him because God is love. God is communal, right? And so in order to possess God, you have to do it together with other people. You have to be willing to do it with other people. And so living a communal life is a natural way in which you come to possess God. Again, I think this is why monastic communities are so important, is they're communities that center on God. And in our modern day, we have all these conflicts between different communities. Community is a word people like to say, but there's so much conflict because our communities are based on things like economics, which is kind of, zero sum. If you have this much, they have that much. Or they're based on, nationality, which is this nationality, I'm that nationality, we're not the same, right? Or they're based on identity, which is even more nebulous. I'm this identity, I'm this identity, and this identity. There's no way, it's much harder to reconcile those claims. The idea behind Catholic community is that, everyone can share in God fully, and no one is diminished. There is no competition over God by nature. You can't compete with other people over God. The more you have of God, the more I have of God, and vice versa. It has to be this complete communal sharing. And the monks obviously lived as economic communists, as a attestation to this principle. They had communal property, but the more important thing is the nature of their community being based around love. And a practical thing from this, there's so many practical things I could say that I think has been important for me, is there's a really big emphasis in monastic literature that anything you do with the community is more important than your own private stuff, even your own private devotions. So a prayer that you say with the community, pray in the office, pray in the mass, is much more important than a prayer that you say by yourself in your cell. St. Bernard of Clairvaux has this nice work where he talks about the stages of pride, where you go from being a good monk to being, basically damned in his view. And the fifth step in this process, I won't go all of them, is the desire to be different. The fifth step of pride is the desire to be different from other people. Which is basically, you don't want to be a monk like the other monks. You want to be special. You want to have your own special practices. And the big thing he says is, this monk does not attend, he does not pay attention in communal prayer, but he spends enormous amounts of time doing his own prayers, right? He values every prayer that he says alone more than any prayer he says with the community, because his prayers are special and they're different and they're better prayers, but the prayers, going to mass with the other monks, say in the office together, he's yawning, he's bored, right? He can't, do it basically, right? So, again, and Bernard is like, by this time he's in big trouble basically, and he's like, often people think this guy is a saint. But if you're a good abbot, remember, this person is a problem. This person is on the path to damnation. He needs to go back. He needs to do better. And obviously that's not the same situation, but I do think it's important having the idea that community things are more important, even than, I think, even more important as ways to come in contact with God. I think something that's really helped me. Doing an act for the community, praying with the community, going to mass, doing these very communal things are the normal ways in which we come into contact with God, as I think has been very helpful for me. That's point number 3. So one more point left. Lee hasn't been too crazy long. Last point is contemplation. Contemplation. So we went from community to contemplation with 2 C's in a row. That's what we call alliteration. It's a rhetorical effect. Which is kind of coming back full circle with the question of, the church teaches that the contemplative life is better than the active life. But what is contemplation? What is the contemplative life? And I think when we think of contemplation, we kind of think of maybe sitting around and meditating, or I don't know what we think of exactly. But in monastic literature, the idea of contemplation is the goal for all Christians. It's not just the goal for monks, right? Contemplation being better than action does not mean that monks are just better than everyone else. It sort of means that, but it also means that our own lives are supposed to be contemplative lives as much as possible. Because what contemplation is a direct sort of experience of God, I guess. It's something supernatural. It's not just something we do. Contemplation is something that God gives us. It's a union with God, it's knowledge of God, it's an experience of God, and it's intimacy with God. That's what contemplation is. It fundamentally. It's not an abstract knowledge, but it's a true intimate relationship with God, a true intimate union with God. And again, this is the only thing that makes monastic life make any sense, I think, is the idea that why are they living like this? They're living like this because they want to contemplate God. They want to be united with God. And I think, frankly, this is the only thing that makes Catholicism make any sense. Why are we living like this? Why do we have all these stupid rules and things that we do on Sunday? And well, it's because we want to know and be united with God. That's the only real answer that makes any sense. We're not, we're not just Stoics or Puritans. We're not just Calvinists. Our goal is not just to do the right thing and to sort of do our duty, but our goal is to be united with God. And in monastic literature, people have this idea monastic literature must be very dry or must be very, and sometimes it is, but monastic literature is also where a lot of the most emotional and even like erotic stuff in the faith is, basically, right? Monks write intensely emotional stuff. They write poetry about God. Like Bernard in the Song of Songs, right, is a really important monastic text. You're supposed to be panting for God, thirsting for him, weeping, longing. It's like, if you read, it's really over the top, basically. It's like really, really over the top, cheesy love stuff, basically, is the way monks talk about God and they talk about contemplation. The point of it is God is the transcendent object of desire, right? Everything that everyone desires or can desire is only desirable because it's a reflection of God or participates in God. So God is by definition the thing that you most want. It's what everyone most wants. It's what everyone has to most want. It's not just like monks are, I could be having fun and working in the stock market, but instead I'm doing all these boring things. I'm sorry. I know I apologize. Should be out here. I could be having fun and very many things, I don't know. But instead, I'm just stuck in this monastery hitting myself with sticks, and because it's my duty, and it's the right thing to do. It's like, no, I'm giving up everything else for the sake of the one thing that I want the most, is the idea of the monastic life. And that's why the monastic life is such an important sign for other Christians who aren't monks, I think. Because the point of, God really is this thing that you already want, and that you should want more than anything else. And you should be willing to give up everything else for the sake of God. That's the whole point of monastic life. Other than that, it doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to just sort of sit around. There's no, and do your duty or whatever. And that even makes only sense you can make of monastic asceticism, which there's a lot of. It can often just put people off. But the point of it is not just don't get distracted by those bad things. Just to do your duty. The point is, don't get distracted from what you really want. Basically, don't get distracted from what you should really want. Don't get distracted with other lesser things. Don't get confused, or stay on track, basically, to this one thing that you want the most, this one overpowering sort of desire, and this one sort of love story. So, again, that's why actually monasticism is the thing that makes Catholicism about love, really, the monastic tradition. It's about love, it's not about, I don't know, what else it could be about. It's not Calvinism, it's not about restoring the order of nature and feeling good about being predestined. It's about this love story between human beings and God. And to close the talk then, I want to quote from Dr. Bernard of Clairvaux, who is known as Doctor Mellifluous, which means the honey-flowing doctor. And he writes all these sermons in the Song of Songs. He gives all these speeches that are really, he's, I think, one of the best people at expressing the beautiful aspects of the Catholic faith and of desire for God. And he's a contemplative, so he lived a very, very ascetic life, but he writes about love, extremely beautifully. So I will close with this quotation. Yes, what is more joyous than this union? What is more to be desired than this love, by which you approach the word with confidence, O soul, and cling to him with constancy, talk to him as a close friend about everything, with as clear a grasp as your desire is bold. It is an embrace, a full embrace, where both are at one in will, and which makes one spirit of two. Nor is it to be feared that inequality between the persons will prevent this coming together in one will. For love knows nothing of such distance. Let someone else be horrified, stupefied, terrified, amazed. He who loves feels nothing of these. His love fills him. Love takes all other affections captive when it comes. Therefore, what it loves, and it knows nothing else.